Montana Territory. Early spring of 1879, the wind was sharp, the sky clean, and the girl in the barn looked like she had not slept in days. Kellen O'Rourke spotted her just after dawn, curled up in the hay near the back wall of his horse barn, half covered with a wool blanket that was not his. She had not broken the lock, had not taken anything, but the way she flinched when he stepped forward told him everything he needed to know. "Hey," he said gently, lowering his voice. "You hurt?" She sat up fast, eyes wide, her hands sliding behind her as if she had something tucked in her skirts. But her fingers came back empty. "No," she rasped. "Just needed somewhere dry. I'll go." "You're not going anywhere," Kellen said firmly. "Not until I know you're all right." She blinked at him, confused. Her dress was wrinkled and mud-stained, her boots soaked through. She looked to be around his age, maybe 20, maybe younger. There was a weariness in her shoulders that told him she had been out in the cold longer than anyone should. Kellen crouched down a few feet away, careful not to spook her. "I'm Kellen O'Rourke. This is my place." "You hungry?" Her mouth parted slightly like she wanted to argue, but hunger won out. She nodded once. Gabriella Zane." He stood and held out a hand. "Come on, I got coffee heating and bread still warm." She did not take his hand, but she followed. That was enough. Gabriella barely spoke through breakfast. She sat at the edge of his kitchen table, hands wrapped around the tin cup, taking small bites like she was not sure it would last. Kellen let her be. She needed warmth and food more than questions. But by the time the fire burned strong in the hearth and her face had color again, she finally looked at him. "I left a place in Great Falls, family I worked for. Things turned bad." "Bad how?" She looked down into her lap. "He started coming into the room at night. His wife knew." She just turned her face to the wall. Kellen's jaw tightened. He had nothing gentle to say about men like that. "Been walking for days." "You picked the right barn," he said. "You can stay here, I got space." She frowned. "You live alone," he nodded. "Had a brother, died 4 years back." This land was his dream, I just keep it running. Gabriella was quiet a long moment. "I can work," she said finally. "I can cook, clean, so I do not want to be a burden." "You are not a burden," Kellen said. "You are a person who needed help, that is all." Her eyes softened a little then. Not much, but enough for him to see she was still in there, still holding on. That night, Kellen laid out clean blankets in the barn loft, where the hay was warmest and the roof never leaked. He stacked extra firewood by the stove in his cabin, then returned to the barn with a lantern in hand. Gabriella stood near the stall where his mare was sleeping. She stroked the horse's nose without fear, her face calm for the first time all day. "She likes you," Kellen said. Gabriella smiled, just barely. "Animals do not lie." He handed her the lantern. "Warm enough I will be." "Thank you, Gabriella," she turned. "I do not like the thought of you sleeping out here. It is better than where I was." He stepped forward, slow. "I can build you a room right beside mine, not in the house but attached, separate door, your own space. You would be safe." Her eyes shined a little, like tears might come, but she blinked them back. "Why would you do that?" "Because no one ever did it for my mother," he said simply. "And you deserve better." Gabriella did not respond, but as he turned to go, she whispered, "I think I'll sleep better tonight." He paused. "Good." The next morning, Kellen cleared the side wall of the cabin and measured the frame for a small room. He worked all day sawing, hammering, fitting the pieces together. Gabriella brought him water, stood back while he worked, asked nothing. By the end of the 3rd day, the walls were up. By the 5th, the roof was sealed. He built a window that faced the fields and carved her name into the inside beam, careful and neat. When he showed it to her, she just stood there in the doorway, staring. "It's yours," he said. "Solid walls, locks. Nobody comes in but you." Gabriella stepped inside. She ran her fingers along the smooth wood, touched the window latch, then turned to face him. "I do not know what to say," she said quietly. "You do not owe me anything." She shook her head. "That is not what I meant." He waited. "I do not know how to live without fear yet," she said. "But around you it feels like maybe I could learn." Kellen's throat tightened. He nodded once. "Take your time." But that night, when he passed by her window on the way back from the barn, he saw her light still glowing. And when he tapped the door frame and called her name, she opened the door and stepped out onto the little porch he had made for her. "You all right?" he asked. She looked up at the stars. "It is quiet here." "Too quiet." She shook her head. "Just peaceful." They stood together in the still air, and for the first time since she arrived, Gabriella smiled without sadness in it. Kellen felt something shift in his chest. Something new. She reached out, fingertips brushing his sleeve. "Thank you for building this for me." He covered her hand with his. "Anytime." They stood like that for a long time, not saying anything, just breathing the same air, watching the stars, and holding on to something neither of them had known they needed until now. By the second week, the frost had started easing off the fields, and the creek behind the cabin ran stronger with snowmelt. Gabriella took to walking along its edge in the late mornings, skirts lifted above her boots, her hair tied back in a way that let the wind play with the loose ends. Kellen kept his distance during those walks, but he noticed how she paused to watch the water, as if trying to match her breath to its rhythm. She came back from one of those walks with her hands full of moss and small flat stones. She set them on the cabin stoop without explanation, and spent an hour arranging them in a pattern that only made sense to her. Kellen leaned on the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth after oiling the plow blades. "That for anything in particular?" Gabriella didn't look up. "My mother used to say stones remember. If you place them with care, they'll hold what you give them." "What are you giving them?" She pressed one into the earth firm. "The bad things, mostly." Kellen frowned. "That work?" "I don't know yet." She finally looked at him. "But I like the trying." He stepped down beside her and crouched, touching one of the stones gently. "You think they'll keep it quiet?" Her voice was softer now. "Better than people do." That night she brought a book to her porch and read by lamplight. Kellen could see the edge of the pages fluttering from where he sat by the fire inside. He didn't ask what she was reading. It was enough just to know she had chosen words over silence. The next morning, Gabriella stood beside him as he hitched the draft horse to the harrow. She glanced at the harness, then back at him. "You mind if I help today?" He studied her hands, still red from the cold, but steady. "You ever worked a field?" "No, but I'm good at watching first." He nodded toward the second yoke. "Then come watch close." They worked until midday, sweat rising off the horse, the smell of wet dirt thick in the air. Gabriella didn't flinch when the lines snapped taut, didn't complain when her boots sank into the furrows. When the sun stood high, they sat under the cottonwood near the fence and shared dried apples and pan bread. She took a long drink from the canteen and passed it back. "I used to think I wasn't built for this kind of life." "What changed?" She shrugged. "Maybe nothing. Maybe I just hadn't seen it done this way." "What weighs that?" With quiet. Later, Kellen set to mending the shed roof. Gabriella climbed up beside him without asking, handed him nails as he needed them. Her balance was sure, her eyes sharp. They didn't talk much, but when their hands brushed reaching for the same board, neither pulled away. As the sun dropped behind the ridge, they watched the sky turn copper and violet. Gabriella sat with her knees drawn up, her chin resting on her arms. Kellen broke the silence. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" She didn't answer at first. Then, "Not lately," he nodded. "Can't say I've ever been anywhere else." "Would you want to?" He thought about it. Maybe if the reason was right. Gabriella turned her head. "What would be a right reason?" He looked at her, the way the light caught the curve of her cheek, the new strength in her posture. Someone worth going with. She held his gaze, something steady passing between them. Then she looked back at the horizon. I think I'd stay if the staying was good. He didn't press her for more. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of thawing pine. When they climbed down, the stars were already pricking through the dark. Before she stepped into her room, Gabriella paused. I've been thinking about planting something in that patch near the porch. What kind of something? Not sure yet, just something that grows. Kellen nodded. You let me know what you need. She gave a small, thoughtful nod, then disappeared behind her door. Inside his own walls, Kellen sat alone by the fire, boots off, hands rough from work. But his chest felt different than it had a month ago. Fuller, quieter. He didn't know what she'd plant, but he had a feeling whatever it was, it would take root. By late March, the fields began to dry enough for planting, and Kellen took to rising earlier, his boots crunching over frost-hardened ground before the sun cleared the ridge. Gabriella joined him most mornings now, her shawl tucked close, hair pinned up beneath a kerchief, and her voice quiet from sleep. They worked side by side without needing to fill the air. One morning, while Kellen was checking the seed sacks stored in the root cellar, Gabriella lingered by the fence that bordered the east slope. When he returned, she was still there, arms folded against the wind, eyes fixed on something farther off than the land. He stopped a few steps behind her. Something out there. She didn't turn. There's a tree down the hill, twisted like wind carved it sideways. I know the one. I was thinking I might want to be buried near a place like that, someplace that doesn't forget weather. Kellen stood beside her, facing the same stretch of land. You planning on dying soon? Her breath shifted, a small sound. Not anymore. He didn't speak. The wind moved through the brittle grass and the broken fence post to their left creaked faintly on its hinge. She glanced at him. Did you ever think about marrying? He rubbed the back of his neck, the question catching him off guard. Thought about it, sure. Never got far with anyone. Why not? Didn't see much sense in tying myself to someone who wasn't ready for the kind of life I live. Gabriella picked a twig off the top rail, rolled it between her fingers. What kind of life is that? Quiet. Long stretches without talk. Hard work. No guarantees. She nodded slowly. Sounds about right. That night, she didn't go straight into her room after supper. Instead, she stayed by the fire with Kellen, her sewing in her lap, the needle flashing in and out of the fabric as the flames threw shadows up the walls. He read from a tattered almanac, lips moving silently, then paused. You're stitching straight, he said without looking up. She didn't glance away from the cloth. I had to learn fast. Torn hems meant extra beatings where I used to be. Kellen set the book down. You don't owe me those kinds of truths. I know. She pulled the thread taut, but I want to be known properly. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. All right then. I never learned how to swim. My brother used to tease me for it. Said I'd sink like a stone if I ever tried. Gabriella smiled faintly. You ever been near water deep enough to matter? A few times. Always stayed on the edge. She tied off the end of the thread and looked up. Maybe you didn't want to drown alone. Kellen met her gaze. Maybe I was waiting for someone who could teach me. They didn't say anything more, but when she stood to return to her room, she left the stitched scrap on the table. It was a square of rough cotton with 2 horses embroidered in the center, one dark, one pale, heads tilted toward each other. The next week brought rain, slow and steady, turning the yard to mud and keeping them indoors more than either liked. One afternoon, while the sky hung low and gray, Gabriella cleared a corner of the main room and laid out a patchwork of dried herbs and roots, some scavenged, some traded for from a passing wagon. She crushed them carefully, mixing them with warm lard in a small tin. Kellen watched from the table, chin resting on his hand. What's that for, hands? Yours crack when you're out too long. He glanced down at his palms, the skin split and raw near the knuckles. Didn't think you noticed. I notice everything, she said. It's how I stayed alive. When she pressed the salve into his hands that evening, her touch was gentle but firm, her fingers sure. Kellen didn't speak. He watched her face, instead the line of her brow, the set of her mouth, the quiet patience in her movements. When she finished, she didn't pull away immediately. Her fingers lingered a moment longer, then slid free. Thank you, he said. Gabriella's voice was calm. You do the same. He didn't answer, but he reached across the table and touched her wrist just once. She looked down at his hand, then back at him. That night she left her door open a crack, not wide, just enough. And when the wind picked up after midnight and the shutters groaned, Kellen rose from his bed and lit a lamp. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway until Gabriella sat up and met his eyes. You all right? He asked. She nodded once. I think so. He hesitated, then stepped inside and pulled the shutter tight, latching it with care. Before he turned to go, she reached for his hand. Stay. He didn't ask what she meant. He simply sat beside her on the edge of the narrow bed. Her fingers found his, and neither one spoke. Outside, the rain fell steady, but the wind had gone still. Inside, the quiet was warm, and for the first time in a long while, neither of them was alone. April brought wind that smelled of thawed roots and wet bark. The riverbanks swelled, and the cottonwoods began to bud out in pale green. Gabriella stood barefoot in the soft mud near the porch one morning, a wooden crate beside her filled with seeds she traded for with the last of her silver combs. She didn't ask Kellen to help, but when he came around the side of the cabin with a hoe and knelt beside her, she didn't stop him. They worked in silence at first, dragging furrows with the flat of the blade, pressing seeds into the soil with their thumbs. When the crate was half empty, Kellen sat back on his heels and brushed the dirt from his palms. You always wanted to grow things, Gabriella nodded. I used to press dried petals between pages when I was a girl. Thought if I could keep them flat and perfect, they wouldn't be lost like everything else. Your mother teach you planting? No. She didn't live long enough. Gabriella dipped her hand into the crate again. I learned mostly by watching old women in town gardens, the ones nobody paid much mind. Kellen reached for the next row. Sometimes they're the ones worth learning from. That evening, she scrubbed the mud from under her nails and combed her hair out slow by the hearth. Kellen was sharpening his blade on the porch, the rasp of metal steady against the stone. She watched his shoulders move, the way he leaned into the work, precise and without waste. When he came back inside, she was still brushing. He paused in the doorway. You ever think about cutting it? Gabriella blinked. Why? He shrugged. Just wonder if it ever feels heavy. She set the brush down. It does, but it's mine. He nodded once. Looks strong. Her lips parted slightly. It is. The next morning, Gabriella didn't rise before dawn. Kellen noticed her door still closed when he brought in wood for the stove. He didn't knock. Instead, he left a tin cup of broth by her door and went to mend the fence along the north ridge. She came out mid-morning, wrapped in her shawl, cheeks pale. She didn't apologize. He didn't ask. They walked the ridge together that afternoon, the sun warming the backs of their necks. Below them, the creek shimmered with bits of light. Gabriella stopped near a cluster of rocks. There's something I haven't told you. Kellen kept his eyes on the water. All right. When I ran from that house, I didn't take anything but what I could carry in my apron, but I did leave behind something I'd meant to keep. He waited. A letter. From my sister. She died in Missouri during the fever 2 years ago. It was the last thing she ever wrote me. I kept it in a box under the floorboard of my bed. Gabriella's voice stayed even, but her hands twisted together at her waist. I couldn't go back for it. Kellen looked at her then. You want to write it down again? What it said? I remember most of it. She glanced at him. But I don't think it would sound the same in my words. He nodded. Still, if you ever want to try, we've got paper. That night, she brought a strip of canvas to the table and began stitching letters into it with black thread. No full sentences, just pieces of what she remembered. Kellen didn't read over her shoulder. He sanded a new beam for the barn instead, though the scrape of her needle was louder than his work. After a while, she laid the cloth beside the fire to keep the thread from puckering. She didn't say what she'd sew next. Rain came again the following afternoon, a soft, soaking kind that made the earth smell clean. Gabriella stood on the porch with a worn oilskin cloak around her shoulders, hands clasped behind her back. You ever been kissed? She asked. Kellen turned from where he was brushing mud off his boots. Once, long time ago, she looked out past the trees. I haven't. He stepped onto the porch, the boards creaking faint beneath his weight. You want to be? She didn't answer quickly. Then, I think so, but only if I get to keep choosing after that. Kellen's voice was low. You always get to choose here. Gabriella turned to him. Her face was unreadable in the soft gray light, but her eyes never wavered. Then yes. He crossed the space between them. She didn't flinch. He lifted one hand, fingers brushing her cheek, then leaned in slow, giving her time. When their lips met, it was careful and warm. Nothing rushed or claimed, just a promise made solid. When they parted, she rested her forehead against his chest. I thought I'd forgotten what gentleness could feel like. Kellen's hand found the small of her back. You didn't forget. You were just waiting on the right place to remember. They stood like that while the rain fell around them, soft and steady, soaking into the soil where things had started to grow. By the middle of May, the garden rows had thickened with green shoots. Beans, squash, and cabbage had taken root, and a row of early carrots pushed through the soil in neat lines. Gabriella knelt beside them most mornings, her skirts hiked just enough to keep dry, her fingers gentle as she cleared the new leaves of soil. Kellen watched her sometimes from the barn door, his hand steady on the bridle he was oiling, the quiet between them no longer filled with caution. One afternoon, she found him in the shed loft sorting through old harness straps and wooden yokes stacked against the beams. You planning to break in another team? She asked, brushing dust from her sleeves. He shook his head. Been meaning to clear this out for years. Figured if I haven't needed it by now, I won't. She stepped over a broken wheel frame and traced the edge of a cracked leather collar. You ever think about building something new instead? Kellen looked up at her. Like what? A wagon, maybe. Something with enough room for 2 people and a small stove, in case we ever want to see what's past the next ridge. He studied her a moment. You thinking about leaving? No, she said. Just thinking about knowing we could. That night, she brought in a stack of old flour sacks she'd stitched into curtains and hung them over the windows in her room. The fabric was uneven, but the pattern she'd embroidered along the hem small pine needles and stitched initials caught the firelight when the wind pushed through the cracks. Kellen stood in the doorway, arms crossed loosely. You make this place feel more like it's meant to last. She fastened the last tie. I plan on it lasting. Later, they sat near the hearth, her head resting lightly against his shoulder as the fire cast a low glow over the floorboards. He reached up, brushed a strand of her hair behind her ear. You ever miss the noise of town? He asked. There wasn't much kindness in it, she said. Just sound, he nodded. Sometimes I wonder if I've gotten too used to being quiet. She turned her face toward him. You're not quiet the way people think. You just don't waste words. He met her gaze. What would you have me use them for? Gabriella took his hand and pressed it flat over her heart. This. When summer rolled in, they took to eating supper outside under the cottonwood. Gabriella brought out a quilt she'd pieced from old shirts and laid it on the grass. Kellen carved a bench from pine planks and set it at the edge of the porch, where the sun dipped low behind the ridge. One evening, as the sky softened into gold, Gabriella brought out a small tin box. She sat cross-legged on the quilt and opened it. Inside were bits of folded paper, a strip of blue ribbon, and a pressed sprig of wild sage. "I've been collecting the things I want to remember," she said. He sat beside her, careful not to shift the contents. "What will you do with them?" "I'll keep them until I don't need reminding anymore." He picked up the ribbon. "Where's this from?" "A girl I met once on the trail. She gave it to me without asking anything. I needed that kind of grace then." Kellen set it back gently. "You ever think about adding something new to it?" She reached into her pocket and took out a small folded piece of paper. "I already did." He waited as she opened it, revealing a few lines written in tidy script. "It's the beginning of a name," she said. He looked at her, brow furrowed. "Whose?" Gabriella's voice was steady. "Ours, in case we ever need to write it down." In the weeks that followed, they began turning the space behind the barn into something more than pasture. Kellen dug post holes, and Gabriella marked the ground with chalk string. They built a small coop, then a smokehouse, both from salvaged wood. Each time they stood back to look at what they'd made, Gabriella would touch his arm and say, "Something worth keeping." When the harvest came early that fall, they worked side by side pulling squash and beans, tying bundles of dried herbs to the rafters. In the evenings, Gabriella stitched a quilt from feed sacks and old flannel. Kellen carved a cradle, smoothing the edges until they shone. One night, as they lay curled together beneath the open window, she placed his hand over the gentle curve of her belly. "I wanted to wait until it felt real," she whispered. He shifted closer, his breath warm against her temple. "It's the truest thing there is." Gabriella's fingers closed around his. "I used to think I'd never belong anywhere." "You belong here," he said. "With me. Always." They married under the cottonwood that October, with the wind tugging at her braid and the smell of wood smoke in the air. A neighbor rode in from 3 ridges over to speak the words, and 2 other families stood witness. Gabriella wore a dress she'd sewn from homespun linen, and Kellen wore his brother's old coat, brushed clean and mended at the sleeve. They exchanged no rings, only vows spoken quiet and clear, with hands clasped and eyes steady. That winter, the snow came early, but their cabin stayed warm. Kellen chopped wood while Gabriella prepared dried roots and wrapped wool around the cradle she'd lined with feathers. When the baby came in late January, she was small but strong, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's quiet. They named her Lydia Zane O'Rourke. Years passed. The garden grew wider, the fields richer. Kellen built another room on the cabin, and Gabriella planted rows of flowering herbs between the vegetables. Lydia learned to walk by following the path of flat stones her mother had once laid, the ones that carried the weight of old sorrows and had long since been reclaimed by peace. On summer evenings, they sat beneath the cottonwood, Kellen with Lydia on his lap, Gabriella leaning against his side. They spoke little, but everything between them was understood. They had made a life not out of what had been taken, but from what had been carefully, patiently built. And in that life, they found what they had once believed unreachable: a love that endured, a home that held, and a quiet that never again carried fear.